All right, who got to have a conversation with somebody under the age of 18? 10 points for you. You're under 18. 10 points for you. Who else gets it? 10 points, 10. Okay, yep, that's 10 there, 10 there. Anybody else under the age of 18? See me afterwards. I'll tell you exactly what they're for. As soon as I figure it out. Okay, that's good. Young people, so glad to have you with us this morning. It's a blessing to have multiple generations represented in the life of our church on a Sunday morning. And super glad you're here. All right, we're going to do a little bit of feedback. Just by show of hands, how many would consider yourself a planner in the room? The planners. Okay, look around, see yourselves. Yep, okay. How many say you're more spontaneous? It's more spontaneous. Anybody that sits in the middle? Some middle people, a couple? Wait, some of you raise your hand all the time. Like, yeah, I'm a planner. No, I'm spontaneous. No, I am planning spontaneously. Yes, okay. All right, so anybody want to take a guess on what you think I am? Okay, how many of you, just by show of hands, how many of you think I'm a planner?
How many points?
Okay, how much points? We'll make 10 points if you get it right. How many of you say spontaneous? More spontaneous? Oh, whoa, okay, all right. Some people know me differently. Okay. I actually am, my lists have lists, if that makes sense. Like, I'm a fairly organized, planned person, but more because I want to leave room for the spontaneous, right? Like, I plan so that I can have space, like, to do fun stuff, right? And so I'm kind of in the middle. You know, there's like introverts and extroverts and ambiverts. That's the other one, right? People who are introverted, they like being, by themselves. They get filled up being alone. Then there's extroverts, people who get filled up being with other people. And then there's ambiverts. Some people are like, yeah, maybe I'll hang out with you. And then they're like, nah, just kidding, right? So it's like in the middle, right? Sometimes I need to be with people. Sometimes I need to be alone. I'm one of those, like, I plan so that I can be present to the moment. Does that make sense? Like, part of the reason that we organize and plan and put schedules, I have spreadsheets. I'm a spreadsheet guy. Reason that is so that when the time comes to just be present to the Holy Spirit and to each other, I can do that. So, all of you got 10 points, whatever you voted. Okay, there you go. I'm a little bit of both. I'm a natural, like, planner, but more spontaneous. You should have seen me when I was in my 20s, though. Oh, golly. Okay. I almost never had a plan. So here's the thing. I would say one of the defining characteristics of many people in our country is this. Americans love to try to control life. Generally. Most Americans have this, like, rather significant white-knuckled death grip around life, right? We kind of default that way. It's kind of built into a bit of our DNA, right? Think about this, right? Have you seen those? Okay, this, for some of the old school analog people, you're like, what are you talking about? But have you seen those, like, things that you mount on the side of your wall in your kitchen, and they're a TV, basically, but it's touchscreen? It's like the family planner, right? Have you seen those yet? Or the refrigerators that have family planning touchscreens on those, right? They exist. Don't look now, because then I'll lose you for the next half hour. But they're real, right? We've got these family planners. We've got e-schedules. We've got life hacks. We've got 5-year goals. We've got retirement calculators. Anybody have doomsday storage? Productivity algorithms, right? We've got an app for just about everything we want to get done. We kind of default, generally, as Americans, to controlling our lives, or at least thinking we can control our lives. And here's the thing. Just so you know, we're in church. I'm saying this out loud. In and of themselves, those things are not wrong. They're not inherently sinful, okay? God's not going to judge you if you get one of those refrigerators with a built-in TV and little buttons on there, right? He might judge you if you, never mind. I'll just leave that up to God. Depends on how you get that TV, okay? I'll stop there. Because listen, the planning ahead of life is actually a biblical concept, okay? Biblically, the book of Proverbs consistently actually praises hard work and diligence and foresight and careful planning. The problem is not the planning. The problem is believing that our plans are the ultimate plans. That's where we get into trouble. This idea that the world around us and sometimes even God himself should conform to the plans that we have made. Anybody ever get mad at God about something that came into your life that wasn't on your planner? Guess what you're doing? You're trying to control your circumstances, including God himself. And so as we spend some more time in the book of Proverbs this morning, this is my leading point, okay? The problem isn't that we plan too much. The problem is that we plan too much without God. The issue isn't that we have plans, it's that we've made them ultimate. The issue isn't that we have organization and moving ahead, right? The issue is that we often do it without God. And that is one of those quiet idols in the modern life, right? Stuff we don't really talk about, but they take up residence in our souls. This illusion that if we can just organize or plan for life well enough that we can eliminate uncertainty and be in control. But King Solomon, one of the writers in the book of Proverbs, he warns us about the dangers of planning without God. And here, this is our one verse for today, Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purposes that prevail. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purposes that prevail. This is week 4 in our Proverbs series, Pursuing the Path of Wisdom. We're doing a summer series on Proverbs. And we're just taking all these different parts of Proverbs that are super applicable to our lives. And we're talking about the wisdom of God. First week, this is how I defined wisdom: the ability to see life from God's perspective and to respond accordingly. Wisdom is recognizing that God has a way of life that he has designed for the world. And that if we lean into that way of life and we respond to that way of life the way that God calls us to, life will go so much better for us. Where we're not resisting God's plan for the world. That's wisdom. Last week I said that wisdom requires us to let go of a way that seems right. Basically, I asked you last week to learn kind of a healthy distrust of your own perspective, right? We talked a lot about how self-deception is so very deep and so very real and so very hard to notice because you're literally deceiving yourself. So the part of you that should know that you're deceived is the thing that's deceiving you. Wisdom requires us to kind of let go of the way that seems right, to embrace kind of a healthy mistrust of our own instincts while developing a deeper trust in the wisdom of God, the direction of God, the way that God says life should go. All right, I want to go back to Proverbs 19:21 with that little bit of background, right? Week 4 in Proverbs, where Proverbs 19:21, many are the plans in a person's heart. But it is the Lord's purposes that prevail. Okay, I thought it'd be fun if I just give you a simple paraphrase of this verse. Okay, it's up to you if you want to take a screenshot of this one, but here's what I would say. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purposes that prevail. Here it goes. You can make all the plans you want, but God gets the last word. You can make all the plans you want, but God will always have the last word. And this Proverbs 19:21, right? Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it's the Lord's will that prevails, right? This isn't the only time we hear this in Proverbs. I'll give you another one. Proverbs 21:30. There is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord, right? Solomon's telling us it's futile for us to continue to make these plans and wisdom and insight without seeking God. because they're never going to succeed. Proverbs 21:30. Proverbs 16:3. Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and He will establish your plans. Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and He will establish your plans. Proverbs 16:9. In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Over and over and over in Proverbs, we are encouraged to plan, but we are warned against planning without God. The issue isn't that we plan too much. The issue is that we plan too much without God. All right, so I want to make this super practical for a minute, okay? I'm going to ask you to turn on your imagination brain just for a few minutes. And imagine if your life and the lives of everyone that you love were suddenly dependent on your ability to get to the moon. Okay? Use your imagination with me. I might have been watching too many movies lately. But what if your life and the life of everyone you love were suddenly dependent on your ability to get to the moon in, let's say, 6 months, right? You got to get to the moon and back in order to save your life and the life of people you love. Can I ask you a question? Would you reach out to perhaps a space engineer, right? An astronaut, a NASA guy, or if you had those 6 months, would you kind of just sit in your backyard with an old garden tractor and some jet fuel and hope for the best? Would you be maybe take some bottle rockets and stick it on the side of an old wheel horse tractor? When all along, right up the street from your house, lives a 35-year veteran of the NASA space program, an engineer who's got a pole barn full of spacecraft and rocket fuel. Okay? Now you're really using your imagination. This is Rubber Town. I mean, who knows? Thank you. There's going to be a lunar lander somewhere around here. But imagine this, right? You genuinely, you come to this place, you realize that in order for you to survive and all the people that you love to survive, you've got 6 months to get to the moon. And 3 blocks up the street from your house, you've got a neighbor full of spacecraft, a retired 35-year astronaut with rocket fuel. And you just sit in the backyard, tinkering. Would you do that? Is that the way you would approach your space travel that would save you and your family? All right, can we agree? The answer is no. Here's the thing. The God of the universe literally created the moon out of nothing using just His voice. And that same God has made a way for us to connect with Him through prayer and His Word and the Holy Spirit, giving us unlimited access to the greatest wisdom that mankind has ever known and will ever know. And yet, so often we just sit in our backyards tinkering with our wheel horses and bottle rockets, while our lives and the lives of everyone else around us are at stake. I have some really good news for you. 2 points. One is, you don't need to get to the moon. But 2, if you have a personal relationship with Jesus, you have direct access with the God who created the moon. And your life and the lives of everyone you love are dependent on not whether or not you get it done, but on what God gets done through you. You see, that hypothetical scenario is exactly what plays out in our lives as Christ followers every time we make plans for our lives without ever talking to God Himself. All right, so let's go back. I want to unpack Proverbs 19:21 with us. Let's kind of go word by word, verse by verse. It's really only one verse, and yet it has the power to completely reshape how we view life on an everyday basis. Notice again that Solomon does not condemn the planning process, okay? He doesn't say it's wrong to plan. He simply puts planning in its proper place, in perspective. And notice that one word, right? Many. Many are the plans in a person's heart. Not just one. We're planning creatures. We dream. We imagine our futures. We script conversations before we have them. Anybody like that? Before you have to have a conversation with somebody, it's kind of already going through your head. What am I going to say? We replay situations in our lives after they happen. Even after the conversation, we're still like, oh, okay, I could have done that differently. We strategize, we leverage, we hustle, we hurry. You see, God designed us with that imagination, that ability to dream for our future. But what happens? Solomon warns what happens is that sin kind of quietly bends our imagination away from God and towards ourselves. Sin bends that gift inward, depending on our own selves. And instead of us asking, what is God building, we begin to ask, what can I build? What can I accomplish? And you know what? This has been humanity's story since the beginning. Last week, we talked about Adam and Eve and how they just wanted life on their own terms. The verse literally says, when she saw that it was good, the fruit, right? She had this it seemed right. Eve wanted a different way apart from God. And not long after that, shortly afterwards, we read about the Tower of Babel in Genesis, where people actually wanted to make a name for themselves by creating this tower that would reach up to the heavens. Again and again throughout the Old Testament, Israel constantly wanted security apart from God, remember? They wanted kings, they wanted financial security, they would have these peace treaties with other warring countries because they didn't depend on God to be their peace. And nothing has changed in our world today. Nothing. We want to build our careers and build our identities and build our platforms and build our brand and build our security and build our nest egg and build our reputations, right? And none of those things are inherently wrong. They're not inherently sinful. The danger comes when our plans become the center of our identity. When our plans become the guiding force in our lives. There's two reasons, okay? Because think about this for a minute. If your identity rests on your plans, then when your plans collapse, so do you. And even worse, if your identity rests on your plans, then if you actually somehow succeed in your plans, you wind up getting all the glory and God gets none. Even if you actually get your plan to work apart from God, guess who gets the glory? Either way, it's a danger. Your plans fall apart and you collapse. Your plans succeed and you rob God. We have so many plans, and yet so many of them have been put together apart from God. Okay, so just fast forward a couple thousand years from Proverbs to Jesus. And think about Jesus with me for a minute. From a worldly perspective, the life of Jesus looked completely unplanned from the beginning, right? To this miraculous pregnancy for a young woman who'd never been married, born in obscurity with some really questionable circumstances in a town that nobody wanted them. Raised in Nazareth, another town that had this terrible reputation. Jesus had no political office. He had no military influence. Jesus had very little wealth, no permanent home, no fancy education, no impressive resume, no list of powerful friends in high places. Even his death looked like a total failure, right? You could argue that the life of Jesus seemed completely unplanned from the outside. But what looks like chaos to the world was actually perfect surrender to the Father's plan, to the Father's purposes for the life of Jesus. Jesus said this phrase numerous times in John 15, and then John 5, then John 6, John 8, several different times. Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father doing. Jesus gave him this answer, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. That's why he says in John 15, apart from me, you can do nothing, because he's saying he can't do anything. Jesus himself says, the Son of Man can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. So if Jesus had to follow his Father's plan, who are you to think that yours doesn't have to bend to the will of God the Father? I only do what I see my Father doing. Friends, we have many, many plans, many, many aspirations, many, many goals and objectives in our lives. The problem isn't that we're planners. The problem is that we're planners who don't consult God first, often. So let's go back. Another word in Proverbs 19:21 I want to bring you attention to, right? Many other plans in a person's heart. That's a really intentional word. Notice the warning here from Solomon about where our plans come from. He says that they come from our hearts. Now, many of us, when you hear the word heart, you think it's emotions, right? Feelings. But in the Hebrew language, Solomon is not just talking about our emotions or our feelings. Solomon is referring to the deepest part of ourselves, the inner self in Hebrew. This same word, heart, is actually used to describe the heart of a tree or the heart of the ocean, right? It's the deepest, most central part of that organism. But the problem, Solomon warns, the problem is that our hearts, they can't be trusted. We saw this last week, right? Jeremiah 17:9. The heart, very same word in Hebrew, the central part of ourselves, the part from which we have our identity and our purpose and our worth and our decision making, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Later, Jeremiah says, Lord Almighty, you who examine the righteous and probe the heart and the mind. He's not just talking about God who probes our feelings, but God who probes the deepest parts of ourselves. And Proverbs 19:21 is warning us that the deepest part of ourselves will come up with so many different plans and schemes and goals and objectives. And if we're not careful, we will default to planning our own lives apart from God. Our hearts can't be trusted to plan in a way that honors God apart from God. All right, another phrase that jumps out to me in Proverbs 19:21. Many other plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. That word purpose is so important for us this morning. God isn't just reacting to life. You ever thought about that? Even in all of our planning, so much of life comes down to our reaction. Something happens, and then we react to it. And then something happens as a result of that, and react to that, right? What Solomon is reminding us is that God doesn't just react to life when bad things happen. He isn't improvising. You ever thought about that? God never goes, didn't see that coming. Right? God never has that thought. He isn't just improvising as he goes along. History itself is not random. The events in our lives actually have meaning and purpose in the kingdom of God. And they only have meaning and purpose in the kingdom of God if we seek God for them, right? Because God always has a greater purpose for so many times in my life. Okay, I just have to admit this out loud as a pastor. So many times in my life, I have gone to God with a plan and just asked God to bless the plan. Hey God, here's my plan. Please bless it. Hey God, here's what I'm doing. Here's where I'm going. Here's what I need to get done. Would you bless it, right? But Scripture, it tells us this different story, because God is inviting us into his plan rather than us inviting God into ours. And there's a massive difference between the two. And it changes everything. Instead of asking God, will you please bless what I'm already doing? Wisdom asks, God, what are you doing? And how can I join you in it? That is a completely different posture when it comes to planning. Let me give you some biblical examples, right? Think about Joseph. The story of Joseph from the Old Testament, right? You get the sense that Joseph just kind of planned to enjoy his life with his family on the farm and take care of some sheep, right? That's what we think. Instead, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, forgotten by numerous people over and over again, imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. And none of that fit the plan that Joseph had for his life. Would you choose that? Betrayed, sold into slavery, forgotten, falsely accused, falsely imprisoned? No. That's not on any of your planning boards. If it is, help me to stop by your house and I'll rewrite your planning board for you, okay? That's not on any of our plans. None of that fit the plan that Joseph had for his own life. And yet, years later, Joseph finally realized something. That God had been writing a much larger story with his life than he could have ever written for his own life. And what looked like detours were actually preparation. Only at the end of Joseph's life could he say very clearly, this is Genesis 50, verse 20, this is Joseph's own words, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." That's Joseph. What about Moses, right? Moses had this plan that he was going to rescue the people of Israel by just killing them off one by one. Remember at the beginning? Killing off the Egyptians, right? A couple of, an Israelite and an Egyptian were fighting, and so Moses just kills them, buries them in the sand, right? That's Moses' plan. He's going to rescue 1 million Israelites from the country of Egypt by slowly killing one and burying them in the sand. And so what does God do? God sends Moses into the wilderness for 40 years of obscurity. Only then was he ready to follow God's plan. David, right? David was anointed. King David was anointed as the king while Saul, the current king, was still alive and in power. And David spent years on the run, hiding in caves, scared for his own life, waiting, trusting, learning, knowing he was anointed by God, but knowing it was not his time yet. You see, God often accomplishes his greatest purposes during seasons that look like interruptions to us. In seasons that look like unplanned interruptions. Because our greatest frustrations often become God's greatest formations. Okay? Can I say that again? Some of our greatest frustrations often become God's greatest formations. Because we tend to measure success by achievement. Love you, baby. Come back when you're ready. We tend to measure success by achievement. God often measures success by transformation. We measure success by what we get done. Jesus measures success by who we become. Not achievement, but transformation. We ask, what am I accomplishing? God asks, who are you becoming? That difference changes everything. Because sometimes the delay in our day is part of the design. Sometimes the disappointment is an invitation to discipleship. Sometimes that closed door is actually protection from God. Sometimes God's greatest gift is saying no to our plans. And here's the thing, right? God's purposes will always lead us towards Jesus. The purposes of God, they're not merely to make sure that your life works out, right? God's not in the business of giving you the American dream, just so you know. That's not God's greatest purpose, to fulfill the American dream in your life, right? God's greatest purpose is that you and I become more like Jesus. Romans 8:29 tells us that God's purpose is to conform us into the image of his Son. Everything else serves that one great purpose, right? Our careers, our marriages, our parenting, our divorce, our success, our failure, our waiting, our suffering, the blessings, the grief, the loss, the no's, all of them are designed so that we would become more like Jesus. Every moment becomes an opportunity for discipleship. And that is why following Jesus isn't about head knowledge, just things that you believe to be true. Following Jesus is about becoming a certain kind of person who increasingly resembles the Jesus of Nazareth. But here's the difference, okay? Just want to fast forward to our moment right now, right? Because Jesus wants to form disciples, our culture wants to form consumers. Have you seen that yet? Our whole society is based on consumption. Our world, the more you have, the more you need, the more you need, the more you have, right? Just like this cycle, right? Jesus forms disciples, our culture forms consumers. Consumers, our culture tells us, get ahead, protect yourself, project the right image, control the outcome, plan your work, and work your plan. Heard that one? That's what culture says. Jesus says, lose your life. Take up your cross. Serve, forgive, trust God's plan, wait, and then wait some more. The wisdom of Proverbs prepares us to hear this invitation from Jesus. The problem isn't that we plan. The problem is that we plan too much without God. And so when you and I, right, as fiercely independent Americans, just say this out loud, when people in our culture hear the word surrender, they often imagine like something really passive, right? Surrender is like we do nothing, we wait around. But biblical surrender is actually more like active trust. You still work, you still plan, you still prepare, you still steward the gifts that God's given you, but you hold everything with this open hand before God day after day, situation by situation, moment by moment. James 4 puts it this way. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. What are they doing? They're planning. Why? You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. If you think James is wrong, just check out the weather forecast for tomorrow. See how it goes, right? We can't even figure out whether it's going to rain tomorrow or not, okay? No offense to the weather people in the room. If you're a meteorologist, Jesus loves you. But we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, James says. We can't figure out whether it's going to rain the next day. And then he asks the question, so what is your life? You're just a mist that appears for a little while and then it's gone. It's like the vapor on those really hot days when we get that flash rain. And then the vapor comes up off the driveway. This is what James is describing. That's our lives compared to God. And then he asked the question, instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or do that. Completely different posture. The problem isn't that we plan too much. The problem is that we plan too much without God. And Proverbs 19:21 reminds us that wisdom is learning to daily surrender our plans to God's greater purpose. Not that we don't plan, but that we surrender that plan. All right, so here's my question. We're at the end. Give me 4.5 minutes, okay? How do we actually live this out? If we're just sitting in our backyards, on our old garden tractor, hooking up bottle rockets, hoping to get to the moon. If our plans are nothing more than the mist that comes after the summer rain, how do we live this out on a daily basis? I have 4 suggestions. for how to make this work in an everyday life. Okay, how do we live this out? First one, would you please join me in making plans prayerfully? There's a difference here. Not just making plans. I'm not asking you to stop planning. I'm asking you to invite Jesus into your planning process. Slow down long enough to ask the Lord, hey God, what are you trying to say to me right now? Where are you moving in my life? What interruption might actually be part of your plan? Slow down long enough not just to ask, what do I want, but what does God want for me? And here's the problem. I don't know if this is true of you. It was for me for a long time. So often we go to God in those really big, important moments when we really need to hear from God, right? And those like life-altering moments will actually like slow down, like, okay, God, should I buy this house or not? Should I marry this person or not? Should I take this job or not, right? We slow down just long enough in these like massive moments. But the problem is it is much harder to hear from God on the big things if we're not hearing from God in the small things. There's so much pressure in that moment, right? When we're trying to make this life-altering decision, we're like anxious and worried and fearful, and we're trying to hear from God, but we haven't heard from God in a really long time, and so we put this pressure on us in the midst of all this important stuff, and yet daily seeking God's plan. Like if we had slowed down before that, before the big moment, if we had daily sought God's plans and purposes for our lives, we'd be able to hear him better in the big moments. I'm not asking you to stop planning. I'm asking you to start planning with prayer. Here's the second one. Do this with me, would you please? Open both hands, palms up in front of you. This is how I'm inviting you to plan your life. I'm inviting you to plan your life with open hands before God. And here's why. Because your plans are not your identity. The things you accomplish are not solely who you are. Your objectives in life does not constitute all of who you are. And if God redirects your plans, he's not trying to ruin your story, friends. If God redirects your plans, he's rewriting it because he's a better author than you and I could ever be. So make plans prayerfully, hold plans loosely, and then number 3, would you pay attention to the interruptions in your life? Some of God's greatest invitations have arrived disguised as inconveniences. Some of God's greatest invitations have arrived as inconveniences. Think about this. Over and over through the Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We read the story of Jesus. That's what the gospel is, the good news of Jesus. Think about how many times Jesus was interrupted that became the part of his story. Blind people, children, crowds, sick people. Even the religious leaders that were trying to discredit him, they were all just interrupting Jesus all the time. The gospel is a gospel of interruptions, is it not? And those interruptions became the miracles that we still talk about today. What if Jesus didn't have time for the woman with the issue of blood? What if Jesus didn't have time for the child that wanted to sit on his lap? What if Jesus didn't have time for the blind man screaming out from the side of the road? What if Jesus had caught those interruptions, had seen those interruptions as simply that, a divergence from his plan? Perhaps the interruption, what we call an interruption, is an invitation that will bring greater purpose to our lives. Make plans prayerfully, hold plans loosely, pay attention to the interruptions, and finally, please trust God's character when you can't see his hand. Every believer eventually gets this place in their lives, every follower of Christ, where God's purposes just don't make sense. I've had several in my 30 years as an adult. We are going to get to this place where God's purposes, they don't make sense to us. And that's where our faith grows. Not because everything all of a sudden becomes really clear, but because we know the one who is ultimately in control. I love how Charles Spurgeon says it. God is too good to be unkind, and he is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart. Friends, we live with so much suspicion around God's intents towards us, and so little suspicion around our own. But God is too good to be unkind. He is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot see his hand, we must trust his heart. When we come to the end of our lives, when we reach the end of our journeys, very few of us will reflect on all the goals that we accomplished. You notice that? Anybody in a nursing home just rehearsing all the things they got done in the last 75 years? We won't be reflecting on the days that our calendars worked out perfectly, will we? We won't be holding on to our promotions or our titles or our achievements. But eternity will reveal something much more beautiful. How faithfully we walk with Jesus, how deeply we love people, how fully we trusted God when life didn't seem to be going the way that we thought it would, how regularly we welcome distractions that were really invitations. That is wisdom. The problem is not that we plan too much. The problem is that we plan too much without God. So here's the invitation, friends, from Proverbs. Keep planning, keep working, keep dreaming, but surrender every one of those plans and goals and dreams to the one whose purposes never fail. Because the safest place in the world is not where everything goes according to our plan. The safest place in the world is where our lives align with the purposes of God through Christ. I'm going to give you a prayer. Invite you to pray this prayer, maybe even daily in this coming week. Again, it is not sinful to plan. It is sinful to plan without God. So here is the prayer. Lord, help me see your purpose and give me the courage to join you there. Lord, help me to see your purpose for my life, for my family, for my marriage, for my job, for my neighborhood, for this problem. Help me to see your purpose and give me the courage to join you there.